who's at Manchester Crown Court. Do also just want to mention, Tom, that crossing earlier today is that Downing Street has not ruled out upgrading the inquiry into the Lucy Letby case to a statutory inquiry. Of course, it comes after the Prime Minister earlier didn't say that, but that's now the statement coming from a Downing Street spokesperson. So that's still possible as well, Tom. But the focus, of course, today will be on the sentence passed down to Lucy Letby, coming after we've given that heartfelt context from the victims' families throughout the morning.
Yes, it's been a very distressing and emotional morning in Court 7 here at Manchester Crown Court, as the families have had their opportunity to articulate just the pain, the torment and the trauma that they have been through as a result of the crimes of Lucy Letby on the neonatal unit in Chester between the summer of 2015 and the summer of 2016. Of course, we know there are serious questions for the NHS Trust about how consultants were alerting them to the fact that they suspected something was wrong, they suspected Lucy Letby. But today, the families of those babies have been front and centre of the hearing, because it's been their opportunity to explain just what this has done to them as families. And very frustratingly for them, Lucy Letby has again elected to stay in the cells in the building here in Manchester Crown Court, but not in the dock, in the courtroom itself, listening to these harrowing details. And I must warn you, some of them, or many of them, are very upsetting to listen to, but they are a barometer, really, of the gravity of this court case, which has played out here in Manchester over the course of the last 10 months. The case of a set of triplets was one of the final series of attacks that Lucy Letby went about in the summer of 2016, in the June. And these were naturally conceived triplets, very unusual, and had caused a great deal of interest on the unit because they were triplets, all three baby boys. And we know now that Lucy Letby murdered two of the triplets in that family. And we've been hearing statements from many of the families today, but the parents of children O and P, as they are referred to, of course, these are not letters, these are children, sons, daughters, grandchildren. But their parents have told the court today what they've been through, and I'll bring you some of that now. The father of O and P said, "I noticed the colour of baby O's skin was changing rapidly. It didn't appear normal to the naked eye. It was horrific to see, and it is an image that I'll never forget. Deep down, I knew it was not going to end well." Baby O received a blessing from the priest and was quickly christened. Moments later, he was gone. I felt like I'd been stabbed in the heart. No words can describe how I was feeling. I kept wishing it had happened to me, and at that time would have gladly taken his place. Baby P, the second of the triplets, sadly passed away later that afternoon. We pleaded with the doctor they had to take the surviving triplet with them to the Liverpool Women's Hospital, and that he could not stay in this hospital in Chester, and that he wasn't safe there. All I could think about, said this father, was about getting the third triplet out of the Countess. Eventually, they agreed to take him, and we were overjoyed on hearing this news. And that is a quite remarkably intense situation that those parents were put in. They realised that something appalling was happening on that neonatal baby unit in Chester, and that two of their boys were murdered by Lucy Letby, and they were frantically trying to get the third surviving triplet away from the unit, away from the danger, to another hospital, to the sanctuary of a hospital in Liverpool. And Lucy Letby was convicted of both of those murders of babies O and P, and we also heard from the mother of those triplets. And you have to bear in mind that their surviving son is now of primary school age. She said, "I've only one photograph of me holding all three boys together. It was incredibly difficult planning funerals for the boys Just deciding what to write on their graves would prove to be a traumatic experience, and one no mother should ever have to do. She talked of her constant fear of anything happening to my children. I refused to go to the hospital ever again. She also talked of the fear of leaving their brother, the remaining surviving triplet, with anyone else. It's been a constant struggle, meeting new people and them asking me how many children I have. She said, my son, the remaining triplet, asks questions about his brothers, and these questions are heartbreaking. I hate that Lucy Letby was the last person to hold my son. She has destroyed our lives. And those are words that are designed to be heard by the court and, of course, most obviously, Lucy Letby herself. But as we know, she is not in the courtroom. She has decided to stay in the cells, effectively hiding from this moment where the families are articulating their pain, their grief and their anger, really. And one of the families, another of the parents of another set of twins attacked by Lucy Letby, have described her decision to stay in the cells as a final act of wickedness from a coward. We also heard from the mother of child N, another of the babies in this case. This was a baby boy who survived and survived repeated attacks by Lucy Letby. The mother of child N has told the court this morning, seeing our tiny baby fighting for his life and not knowing if he would live or die. I honestly knew that child N had been deliberately harmed. I just kept questioning why our healthy baby boy was fine 1 minute and then bleeding from the mouth and needing CPR the next. Our trust has been broken. They're the words of child N, one of the 17 babies who were part of this trial, and we should also spare a thought for those families who did not get to the point of having a verdict in relation to the charges about their child's care, because the jury, despite the fact that they had 110 hours of deliberation over the course of the last month or so, could not reach verdicts in every single one of the 22 charges that Lucy Letby faced. It is one of the most disturbing, upsetting trials ever heard in the UK, and today is the end of that trial. It is not the end of the questions or the family's search for truth, as we know that there will be an independent inquiry at the very least, and Downing Street confirming today that they've not ruled out that that could be upgraded to a full public inquiry. And we know that the police, many of the officers who have investigated this case, are in court today listening to this, the culmination of their work in relation to those 17 babies at the heart of this criminal trial. They are examining more cases where there may have been suspected attacks by Lucy Letby. There was no clear moment where something changed and they realised that that was the point she started attacking babies, so there could yet be further cases. A hugely momentous day for those families at the heart of this case in Manchester, and we will be hearing now from the judge and his sentencing remarks.
Has refused to attend court for this sentence hearing. Accordingly, I have to sentence her in her absence. I shall deliver the sentencing remarks as if she was present to hear them, and I direct that she is provided with a transcript of my remarks and copies of the victim personal statements read to the court. Lucy Letby, over a period of almost 13 months between June 2015 and June 2016, when in your mid-20s and employed as a neonatal nurse in the Countess of Chester Hospital in Chester, with specialist training in intensive care, you murdered 7 babies and attempted to murder 6 others. In the case of one of them, trying on separate occasions 2 weeks apart to murder her. You are now to be sentenced for your crimes. I order payment of the statutory surcharge in the appropriate amount. You acted in a way that was completely contrary to the normal human instincts of nurturing and caring for babies, and in gross breach of the trust that all citizens place in those who work in the medical and caring professions. The babies you harmed were born prematurely, and some were at risk of not surviving. But in each case, you deliberately harmed them, intending to kill them. In your evidence, you said that hurting a baby is completely against everything that being a nurse is, as indeed it should be. You also claimed you never did anything that was meant to hurt a baby, and only ever did your best to care for them. That was but one of the many lies you were found to have told in this case. There is no doubt that you are intelligent and outwardly were a very conscientious, hard-working, knowledgeable, confident and professional nurse, which enabled you repeatedly to harm babies on the unit without arousing suspicion for some time. You prided yourself in your competence. Your fellow neonatal nurses spoke very highly of you, and several of them became your close friends. Having started as a Band 5 nurse at the Countess of Chester in 2012, you became a mentor to student nurses, and in the spring of 2015 gained the qualification that enabled you to care for the sickest babies on the unit or those requiring the most intensive care. You relished being in the intensive care nursery. Your messages to colleagues revealed an interest in babies that were on or were coming to the unit who had uncommon medical conditions. The methods you employed to carry out your murderous intent were only revealed by the later detailed investigation into the events of and surrounding the collapses and deaths of the babies, which commenced in 2018. There was premeditation, calculation, and cunning in your actions. You specifically targeted twins and latterly triplets. Some babies were healthy, others had medical issues of which you were aware. The great majority of your victims suffered acute pain as a result of what you did to them. They all fought for survival. Some, sadly, struggled in vain and died. You used a number of different ways to try to kill them, thereby misleading clinicians into believing the collapses had or might have had a natural cause or were a consequence of a developing medical condition. You took opportunities to harm babies when staff were in breaks or away from babies. On some occasions, you falsified records to indicate there were signs of a deterioration before a collapse occurred. You knew that the last thing anyone working in the unit would or did think was that someone caring for the babies was deliberately harming them. As the number of unexpected and unexplained collapses and deaths escalated, senior doctors started to think the unthinkable and consider the possibility that someone was, in fact, deliberately harming the babies, and you were identified as the common factor. You had a detached enthusiasm for the resuscitations and what followed. You endeavoured to impress colleagues and clinicians and sought reassurance from them as to your competence and skills, and would message others to the effect that no one was at fault. On occasions, you cruelly and callously made inappropriate remarks to some of the grieving parents at the time of or in the immediate aftermath of a death. When the homes of both you and your parents were searched, confidential documents relating to babies, including handover and resuscitation sheets, and notes and blood gas readings were found, and there were entries in a diary recording relevant events. Handover sheets relating to all but the first 4 of the babies had been taken from the unit and kept by you. I am satisfied you started to keep these documents after those initial offences in June 2015 as morbid records of the dreadful events surrounding the collapses of your victims and what you had done to them. You had a fascination with the babies and their families, which extended to making repeated searches on Facebook for their parents, sometimes immediately following the events, and on occasions much later. A piece of paper with dense writing on both sides, setting out your thoughts and feelings, was found in the first search of your home in 2018. Amongst the phrases you wrote were, "The world is better off without me," and "I am evil, I did this." The impact of your crimes has been immense, as disclosed by the deeply moving personal statements that have been read to the court this morning. The lives of newborn or relatively newborn babies were ended almost as soon as they began, and lifelong harm has been caused, all in horrific circumstances. Loving parents have been robbed of their cherished children, and others have to live with the physical and mental consequences of your actions. Siblings have been deprived of brothers and sisters. You have caused deep psychological trauma, brought enduring grief and feelings of guilt, caused strains in relationships and disruption to the lives of all the families of all your victims. It is no part of my function to reach conclusions as to the underlying reason or reasons for your actions, nor could I, for they are known only to you. I must pass appropriate sentences according to law, addressing the seriousness of your offences.
As we mentioned before, we are listening to Mr. Justice Goss for the sentencing of Lucy Letby, and that there will be brief moments where the camera feed and audio will cut out. That's based on the need for privacy and anonymity of the victims' families, and we're in one of those blackout moments right now. It will likely happen a few more times during the sentencing. Just to sum up what Mr. Justice Goss has been saying there, that her actions show premeditation, calculation and cunning, and that the great majority of her victims suffered acute pain, and of course saying that she had a fascination for the babies and their families. Mr. Justice Goss said at the start of these remarks that he'll deliver them as if she is there. Of course, we know that Lucy Letby is not present. She decided instead to stay in her cell and not to face the victims' families' statements that preceded the sentencing, nor the sentencing itself. But Mr. Justice Goss said a transcript must be handed to her afterwards. Let's bring in our Tom Parmenter, who's at Manchester Crown Court and has been there throughout the course of the day. And Tom, we're in one of those brief moments. Just remind us why there are these brief moments of blackouts in the feed from the court.
Yes, if you've followed any stage of this trial, you know that the families in this dreadful scenario have been given anonymity by the court, and the pause in the feed from Court 7 is due to the fact that we have to do everything to protect the identities of those families. That is the anonymity order prescribed by the court, and therefore there's a slight pause, and we will rejoin Mr. Justice Goss for the next stage of his closing remarks and sentencing remarks. But we know, of course, that Lucy Letby is not in the courtroom listening to all this. She will be given a copy of it, but that is a source of enormous frustration for the families inside court. Let's rejoin Mr. Justice Goss in Court 7.
Which was being treated by antibiotics. However, his breathing stabilised. He was being fed by a nasogastric tube. You messaged a colleague saying you needed to throw yourself back in and take an ITU baby soon. On that night shift of the 13th, 14th of June, you were the designated nurse for 2 babies.
And we're just going to have to pause away from Court 7 once more. As we explained, this could be the pattern of the sentencing remarks due to the anonymity orders of the families and babies involved. They've, throughout this trial, just been known by a simple letter between A and Q. And of course, these are not letters, these are children, these are babies, often the most tiny, fragile babies cared for by the NHS, who were on the neonatal unit in Chester between the summer of 2015 and the summer of 2016. The judge in those sentencing remarks was very clear that the absence of Lucy Letby from the dock, she's chosen to remain in the cells inside the building but not come up into the actual courtroom for either the victim impact statements that we heard from the families through the course of this morning, or indeed the judge's remarks, which we will now be able to recross and rejoin inside Court 7.
You will have been aware that she was being treated for an infection and were the designated nurse for 2 other babies in that nursery on that night shift. You decided to kill her and administered air into her intravenously, causing her to die from air embolus. You were involved in her resuscitation.
And at that point, we will have to just dip back out of the recording or the live feed from inside Court 7, as I say, due to the anonymity orders around this case that protect the identities of the families. And we've had a very clear picture today from many of the families as to the harrowing impact that these crimes have had on them. And as I say, they are known simply as letters in our reporting of the trial. But because it is of utmost importance that those anonymity orders are respected, that is why we are having to pause the feed of the judge's sentencing remarks, and we'll rejoin it when we can. Just to recap what Mr. Justice Goss has said so far in his sentencing remarks at the end of Lucy Letby's trial. He said that she has told many lies throughout the trial. He said you appeared outwardly to be a caring, compassionate nurse, but you were causing acute pain. And he talks about a detached enthusiasm for resuscitation. Let's rejoin Court 7 and the live feed.
And was seen by his mother. She was very concerned, and you sought to reassure her. The circumstances of the attempted resuscitation and his death were harrowing, with profuse bleeding. At the time, the clinicians thought he may have died of necrotizing enterocolitis, and no post-mortem was undertaken. You commented in messages to colleagues that he had a massive hemorrhage, and it could have happened to anyone. On the following night shift, the 4th to 5th of...
We will just have to pause our coverage from inside the courtroom number 7 here at Manchester Crown Court once more. As I said, this is because of the anonymity of the families, and the instructions have been quite clear as to how the sentencing remarks will be delivered, and that there will be this slightly abridged live feed because the anonymity of those families has to remain in place. But Mr. Justice Goss explaining the many lies that Lucy Letby has told through the case. He talked of her detached enthusiasm for resuscitation, that she wanted to be part of the centre of attention, and that could be a contributing factor. But we will never truly know, and he acknowledged in those remarks that we will perhaps never really know what led her, what drove her to attack so many babies in her care in a place that should have been a sanctuary for those families. He said siblings have been deprived of brothers and sisters, and the reasons are known only to you. And as I say, she is not in the courtroom herself. So while this is addressed to Lucy Letby, she's not in the dock. She's chosen to stay in the cells, as we've seen in other high-profile cases, this pattern emerging of people responsible for heinous crimes choosing and being able to choose to stay in the cells and not face that moment of reckoning, not face the impact of the families, and not face, in some cases this morning, the mothers of some of the babies who stood up in court and gave the most poignant, emotional and distressing statements about what they have been through over the course of the last 7 years. Some of them, 7 of them, lost their babies, and others are still have their babies or who are now children. Let's go back now to the live feed inside court.
Survival. She did survive. By the 13th of August, she was stable and was transferred to the Countess of Chester, where the general trend of improvement continued. The 7th of September was her 100th day of life. Nurses had planned a small celebration, including the display of a banner. On the night shift of the 6th to 7th, you deliberately...
You're watching live coverage from the Manchester Crown Court, where Lucy Letby is being sentenced for her crimes. At the moment, we're having to dip in and out of some of the sentencing remarks from the judge inside Court 7 to preserve the anonymity of the families who have the court order in place, which means we can't bring you every moment of the sentencing remarks, but we are working to ensure that we can bring you as much as we can safely broadcast. The breaks in the coverage are due to the fact that those anonymity orders are in place, and it's to protect the names and identities of the families at the very heart of this very troubling and very traumatic case. Lucy Letby, of course, was convicted here on Friday of 7 murders and the attempted murder of 6 other babies inside the neonatal unit in Chester between the summer of 2015 and the summer of 2016. Mr. Justice Goss inside Court 7 right now is delivering those sentencing remarks when we know that Lucy Letby is not in court. We can now cross back in to listen to Mr. Justice Goss as he continues to deliver these final remarks.
It requires constant nursing care and attention, and will require surgery and support throughout her life. Just over a month later, on the 20th...
Now, as I've explained, we are having to dip in and out, and it is slightly frustrating because the thread of what Mr. Justice Goss is saying is obviously disrupted by that. But to give you an idea, he is going through at the moment the individual care and harm that was done by Lucy Letby to those babies. Let's hop back onto the feed inside Court 7 and Mr. Justice Goss.
In September, you infused a large quantity of air down her nasogastric tube into her stomach and bowel, thereby interfering with her breathing, reducing her oxygen saturations and heart rate, and causing her to vomit and require oxygen under pressure. It is also likely that in the early hours of the 13th of October, you infused air into her venous system. The following night, she collapsed again, but recovered with breathing support and was transferred to Arrow Park for 2 days. 6 days after her return, on the night of the 22nd to 23rd of October, she suffered her final collapse, crying out in severe pain as a result of air embolus after you had injected air into her venous system. She too died in her parents' arms.
Good afternoon from Manchester Crown Court, where Mr. Justice Goss is about to sentence Lucy Letby for the murder of 7 babies in her care and the attempted murder of 6 others. There is a live camera broadcasting his comments in the courtroom behind me, but on occasions we have to dip out of that live feed for legal reasons. Quite simply, the judge in this case has put a court order on us naming any of the babies involved. The reason for that is to protect those little victims and indeed the parents for life. They've been granted anonymity for life so that they don't have to go through any more grief, hurt and sadness in coming years. They'll be able to leave this courtroom in the knowledge that no one will ever know their identities. But of course, from a technical point of view, it does mean that we do have to dip out of the judge's comments. Now, this morning we've been hearing from the victims' families, some heart-wrenching detail about what they went through when they found out that Lucy Letby had been arrested on suspicion of murdering or attempting to murder their newborn children. We heard from mothers and fathers who went into, at times, excruciating detail about what it was like to know that a baby had been born just a few days or even hours earlier was being attacked by this woman who was there to care for them, to nurture them, to make sure that eventually they left the hospital and were able to lead fulfilling lives. And of course, as we know, that simply wasn't the case. She was hiding behind a facade of being a confident, accomplished nurse, hiding the evil that lay within. The judge has been detailing some of this case, and he is continuing to do so before he gets to the moment of sentencing itself. He said about Lucy Letby, "You acted in a way completely contrary to the natural human instinct of caring and nurturing babies." He said, "You deliberately harmed them, intending to kill." He talked about her accomplishments as a student nurse. "You are intelligent," he said, "and outwardly very conscientious. You became a mentor to student nurses and you relished being in the intensive care nursery. But there was premeditation, calculation and cunning in your actions. You cruelly and callously made inappropriate remarks to some of the grieving parents at the time of or in immediate aftermath of a death." So we are going to go back and hear what else Mr. Justice Goss has to say in a few more minutes. But as I'm saying, it is difficult to dip back in because he will be naming those children in the courtroom, and we are prevented from doing that, as I explained, for reporting restrictions are on this case. Inside the courtroom are, of course, many of the parents of those little victims. They are wearing a pin badge, many of them, as are the police officers who have been by their side throughout this trial. A sense of unity amongst them against the evil that they have all experienced. Also in court, some of the jury members, not all of them, but some of the jurors have decided to come back here today. We know, of course, on Friday the judge dismissed them and thanked them for their work. They deliberated for 22 days in total, more than 110 hours, work that at times will have been extremely distressing and hard for them to do. But they wanted to be here today, as is their right, to hear exactly what Mr. Justice Goss has to say, and of course to hear his final sentence when it eventually comes. Of course, they are probably more than anybody else aware of all the evidence in this trial, having gone through all 22 counts with meticulous detail, and it is that detail which the judge is now going through for one final time. We know when those verdicts were finally delivered, some of the jury members were in tears, others had their heads in their hands because clearly this has taken an enormous toll on them. We should also spare a thought today for those families who didn't get a verdict which they so had hoped for. Let's return to the court.
Were truly horrific. After these last collapses and deaths, you were suspended from nursing duties, but pursued complaints of being treated unfairly. When your home was later searched, as well as your 2016 diary, which contained references to long days on the 23rd, 24th and 25th of June, and to J, E and M, respectively, there were handover sheets over that period with resuscitation notes written on the back. All, I have no doubt, being records that you kept to remind you of the details of the consequences of what you had done to those children. For the offence of murder, the sentence is fixed by law and is imprisonment for life. You are now 33 years of age and were over 21 when you committed the offences. Pursuant to the relevant prevailing statutory regime, by having regard to Schedule 21 to the Criminal Justice Act 2003, I have to determine whether the seriousness of the offences of murder, individually or in combination, is so exceptionally high that I should not make a minimum term order and you should spend the rest of your life in prison. For offences of attempted murder, whole life sentences of imprisonment are reserved for wholly exceptional cases. Over a period of just under 13 months, you killed 7 fragile babies and attempted to kill 6 others. Some of your victims were only a day or a few days old. All were extremely vulnerable. They were in a hospital where others were striving to provide them with dedicated medical and nursing care. By their nature and number, such murders and attempted murders by a neonatal nurse entrusted to care for them are offences of very exceptional seriousness. The damaging impact of your actions on others working at that hospital, including those who numbered you as a friend, betraying their trust and creating upset and suspicion, as well as eroding confidence in clinicians and nurses generally, aggravates their seriousness. This was a cruel, calculated and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children, knowing that your actions were causing significant physical suffering and would cause untold mental suffering. You created situations so that collapses or causes of collapses would not be obvious or associated with you. You removed and retained confidential records of events relating to your crimes and checked up on bereaved parents. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions. During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. In their totality, the offences of murder and attempted murder were of exceptionally high seriousness, and just punishment, according to law, requires a whole life order. Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.
So there we have it. The sentencing of Lucy Letby is complete. On each, she was imprisoned for life. Mr. Justice Goss saying early release provisions apply. Lucy Letby will remain in prison until she dies. The judge said you created situations so collapses wouldn't be related to you. He said deep malevolence bordering on sin. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. This will be a whole life order. He said you killed 7 fragile babies. attempted to kill 6 others, offences of exceptional seriousness. It was a cruel, calculated and campaign of child murder. Well, we know Lucy Letby was not in the courtroom. Hear those words from the judge. That will now be laid. But in her victims, the parents of those attacked and attempted to. Tom is with me. Himself.
Just going to pick up briefly whilst we sort out the connection problems there to Jonathan and Tom at Manchester Crown Court. But the headline there you heard, which Jonathan was summing up, was that Mr. Justice Goss handed out not just a life sentence, but a whole life order on each and every offence of the 7 cases of murder and 6 of attempted murder to Lucy Letby. So the headline, of course, that she will spend the rest of her life in prison due to that whole life order. During the course of the remarks, which were interrupted at times in order to preserve the privacy and anonymity of the victims, when the remarks of the judge did touch on their identities, we did hear some quite incredible comments from Mr. Justice Goss. He said that the methods Lucy Letby employed to carry out her murders were premeditated, calculated, and showed cunning. She showed a detached enthusiasm for the resuscitations and what followed during the course of these murders, and she at times made cruel and callous remarks to the parents of the victims. He went on to say that Lucy Letby had a fascination for the babies and their families, at times searching for the parents on Facebook, often immediately after she had killed their children. Many of these summing up statements from the judge, of course, took place in absence from Lucy Letby herself, who, of course, decided not to attend not just the sentencing today, but the preceding victim impact statements, and, of course, was only present for the very first of the judgments being answered last week. We can now just bring you once again the key final sentencing of Lucy Letby by Mr. Justice Goss just moments ago.
During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. In their totality, the offences of murder and attempted murder were of exceptionally high seriousness, and just punishment, according to law, requires a whole life order. Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.
That is Mr. Justice Goss, who has presided over this whole trial with huge skill and, of course, sensitivity. And this really does now conclude the events that have been taking place over 10 months here at Manchester Crown Court. Lucy Letby sentenced to a whole life order. It means that she will never leave jail. There will never be any chance for her parole. Reaction, of course, is coming in. We've just heard from the Crown Prosecution Service. The senior Crown prosecutor, Pascal Jones of Mersey, Cheshire CPS, says today's sentence means Letby will never again be able to inflict the suffering she did while working as a neonatal nurse. She has rightly been brought to justice by the courts. My thoughts remain with the families of the victims who have demonstrated enormous strength in the face of extraordinary suffering. I hope that the trial has brought answers which had long eluded them. Lucy Letby, of course, not in that courtroom to hear her sentence. She will now be aware of it, of course. She will be told that when she leaves the courtroom here in Manchester, she will go to jail and she will never be released. Tom Parminter is here with me. Tom, of course, it's what the families hoped for, it's what the families expected, but it is quite a moment when you hear that sentence being handed down.
It is, and we know the gravity of Lucy Letby's crimes. They've been outlined in huge detail here over the last 10 months, but still to hear that phrase, whole life order, the gravity of it all becomes even more significant. It's something that I think has led today to one of the most emotionally charged sessions ever seen in a British court. The families this morning were given the opportunity to articulate the pain, the trauma, the distress and the suffering that they have been through over the course of the last 7 years because of this killing spree that Lucy Letby went on over a 12-month period between the summer of 2015 and the summer of 2016. We heard the judge there talk about how her crimes went completely contrary to normal human instincts and how she had told many lies through the course of the trial, had outwardly appeared to be a caring, compassionate and dedicated nurse. But the truth was far more sinister and harrowing. And the words that were spoken in court by some of the mothers themselves this morning, just unbearable to listen to. And they talked about the grief, the heartache, the never-ending impact of her crimes. And now we know the sentence.
One of the prison officers who had been supporting Letby through this trial has been seen wiping her eyes in court. And I can also tell you that the judge has addressed the families directly in the last few moments. He said, "For those of you who have lost a child, you have my sincerest condolences. I am deeply conscious of your losses. Your lives were and will remain transformed by these events." And as you've been saying, she attempted to murder babies, and some of those babies will have the effects of that for the rest of their lives, damaged in terrible ways.
Yes, and they are known as letters in this case, and that's how we are able to report the case. Their names have been used during the trial, and of course, these are not letters. These are sons, daughters, grandchildren, nieces, nephews. And their lives were taken away by Lucy Letby, and in some cases they were just days old. In many cases they were premature babies. That's why they were on the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. And we heard from the father of child G, one of the most premature babies in this case, who talked about how now she will never have a first kiss. She will always be in her chair. They don't know how long she has to live. And we heard, I think, it was one of the most unbearable moments in court, really, to listen to the parents of the triplets in this case, one of the final cases in this killing spree. They had triplets on the neonatal unit, and the mother of those triplets told the court today that she only has one photograph of her holding her 3 boys. She said she lives now in a constant fear of anything happening to my children. I refuse to ever go to the hospital again. And she said, my son, the remaining surviving triplet, asks questions about his brothers, and these questions are heartbreaking. She added, I hate that Lucy Letby was the last person to hold my son. She has destroyed our lives. And that theme was repeated over and over again through the course of this morning.
Tom, we've heard from the Justice Secretary in the last few moments. He has tweeted the following: Lucy Letby is not just a murderer, but a coward whose failure to face her victims' families, refusing to come into the court and refusing to come up from her cell is the final insult. We are looking The Justice Secretary goes on to say to change the law so offenders can be compelled to attend sentencing hearings. One more time, that's from the Justice Secretary. Lucy Letby, not just a murderer, but a coward whose failure to face her victims' families, refusing to hear their impact statements and society's condemnation is the final insult. We're looking to change the law so offenders can be compelled to attend sentencing hearings. Tom, there has been some frustration that the government seen as perhaps dragging its feet over this issue.
Yes, and that's articulated by some of the families in court today. They described it as one final act of wickedness from a coward. And there are very strong opinions on how this can be improved for victims' families. We know that it's been repeated in other high-profile cases. The mother of Olivia Pratt-Corbell, who was shot dead in Liverpool, her family had to go through that scenario of not seeing the killer face up to that moment of reckoning in the case, the moment that they are sentenced. And to have an empty dock inside courtroom 7 in Manchester today with just 3 empty chairs in it was extremely painful for those families, and I'm sure will lead to further debate. I know the former Justice Secretary has suggested perhaps the proceedings should be beamed into the cell through a TV or an audio feed into the cell of the court so that the perpetrator cannot avoid it, or there are thoughts as to whether they should be physically brought into the dock. But at the moment, as the rules stand, the judge cannot compel the defendant to be, and now the convicted murderer, to be in that dock. And that is a point of great frustration for the families who, I think with enormous dignity and enormous composure, have articulated what this case has been about today. They have been at the heart of this. They have always been at the forefront of the police officers' minds who went into this trying to work out what was going on that neonatal unit after those consultants had raised concerns that had finally led to the police being called in. We know that the NHS Trust will have further questions and scrutiny around how they dealt with the people who were on that unit who were telling them, look, something is wrong. Lucy Letby is the common thread on all this, but it took a police investigation to really understand, piece together, and quite skillfully assemble the evidence that showed that she was guilty. It took the jury, as we know, 110 hours or more to reach those verdicts on Friday, and now we know that Lucy Letby, aged 33, will spend the rest of her life in prison. Her parents, who have been at this trial throughout, were also not in court to hear that moment, and no doubt it is relayed to her perhaps by her legal team inside that cell here at Manchester Crown Court. But she will drive away from this building, taken in under police escort, no doubt, in the next hour or two, knowing that she will never see the outside of a prison ever again.
Yeah, it was interesting hearing from Olivia Pratt-Corbell, wasn't it? Her mother yesterday. You remember Olivia, just 9 years old when she was shot in Merseyside a year ago. Her mum, angry, of course, that her daughter's killer refused to come up from the cell. But she told Sky News, and it was remarkable to listen to, really. She said to Sky News that the families here mustn't let that destroy them. The fact that she's not come up to listen to her sentence, it mustn't destroy them. They must move on from this, otherwise it will just eat away forever. Well, as I said earlier, following the sentencing today, we did have a statement from the Crown Prosecution Service in Cheshire. I can read that again to you. Today's sentence means Letby will never again be able to inflict the suffering she did while working as a neonatal nurse. She has rightly been brought to justice by the courts. The statement goes on to say, my thoughts remain with the families of the victims who have demonstrated enormous strength in the face of extraordinary suffering. I hope that the trial has brought answers which had long eluded them. Let's get more reaction now from Tanya Adkin, who is Vice Chair of the Criminal Bar Association. Tanya, this is a horrific case, of course, the worst imaginable. But today, finally, the victims can leave this building, the victims' families can leave this building in the knowledge that Lucy Letby will never leave prison.
This is one of the most serious cases that we've ever had in our country. Highly unusual, highly exceptional, as the judge described it. And it's highly upsetting, I understand, and I'm sympathetic to those families who have been through such trauma that they feel even insulted by the fact that the murderer, Lucy Letby, doesn't come up to court and stay in the dock. But they need to realise that she has not taken control of this sentencing process. The sentencing process went ahead whether she was there or not in the same way. And their concerns and the impact on them was at the forefront of the judge's considerations today in them being able to be heard. A defendant's right to be heard, of course, if they forego that right by not attending court, then they are not to be listened to. And as the judge said, she's shown no remorse, and there's nothing to be said about her failing to attend.
But you can understand, can't you, not only from the families, but from many of us around the country, they want her dragged into that courtroom, kicking and screaming if necessary.
Well, I can understand that, but and there is, of course, room to examine how that would be done. How would someone be taken up to court? It needs to be remembered that the prison escort services that are responsible for bringing defendants into the courtroom itself, they don't have specialists for training for this. And of course, any reaction by a defendant is wholly unpredictable. One might ask, well, what do you want? Do you want a defendant kicking and screaming? Do you want a defendant laughing or joking or protesting their innocence? So I do sympathise and I do understand why everyone feels so strongly about this. But one has to remember the court of law is not a court for the showing of defendants so that they can be an animal looked at in a cage or looked at for an emotional response, because the court deals with emotion in a very specific way. And the most important thing is that the victims had their voice heard today by the judge, and a whole life order was handed down for these despicable crimes.
This one's fine, but I reckon we just...
Yeah, it would be very difficult, wouldn't it, of course, if that courtroom turns into a circus. But Sir Robert Buckland, former Justice Secretary, Conservative MP, of course, he had an idea. He told me last week on Sky News that one solution could be to have a live feed of the court proceedings in the cell and a camera in the cell as well. I mean, is that something that is feasible?
Well, it needs to be thought through. I mean, the difficulty is that we just don't have the resources in our court system at the moment, or the structures in place for technology like that to work. It still doesn't mean that Lucy Letby is forced to listen. I don't know. She could simply refuse to listen and put her fingers in her ears. I don't know. But the reality is, if the problem is that it's the victims that want to see a defendant in the dock, then that needs to be looked at as to whether that's possible or feasible. Whether it can be beamed to her is another matter. But of course, she will have had disclosure. Her legal team will have had disclosure of the victim impact statements, and she will know what her sentence is. That won't change.
Tell me how rare a whole life order is, because often we hear murderers being sentenced to life, but then in 20, 30 years' time, if they've behaved well in court, they're allowed out on parole.
Well, it's not behaved well in court. In fact, lots of work goes in after a defendant is sentenced to assess their remorse or empathy or whether they're going to be a risk to the public. The issue really at the end of the day for the parole board is whether they are publicly long after a lengthy period of imprisonment. That is not going to be the case for Lucy Letby. She's been given a whole life order, which is rare and reserved for the most serious cases that our country ever sees.
And clearly in this case, Letby has shown no remorse whatsoever, the judge saying that there were no mitigating circumstances.
Quite. And indeed, I don't know whether it's a surprise to many people that she did refuse to come to court because of the comment made by his lordship in the sentencing remarks might indicate that was something of her attitude.
Yeah, no, I don't believe. No.
And just reflecting on this trial, the longest murder trial the country has seen, 9 months, and then a further month of deliberating by the jury. Just reflect on it, if you would, for me, what you made of how it was conducted.
Well, I think personally, I think it's a matter of pride for our country that we could have a trial that went into such detail and took the time necessary for the jury to understand all of the details and all of the evidence, because it was very complicated, because you're dealing with a professional who was at work, and all of the notes and all the other medical conditions concerning the young babies were highly important, a highly sensitive case. And our jury were able to do that in an unbiased fashion and listen to all of that evidence over a very long period of time. I think it's a matter of pride that our country can put those trials and put justice to the test in those sorts of trials, in these sorts of very exceptional circumstances.
OK, we'll leave it there. Tanner Akin, Katie, thank you very much indeed for your input. It's much appreciated as we get ongoing reaction to the news that Lucy Letby has been given a whole life order. She will never leave jail for the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 6 others. Our correspondent Tom Parminter, who's been following this case way before the trial even began, is with me. Lucy Letby not in court, Tom, but many of the victims' families were.
Yes, it's been one of the most extraordinary sessions of a British court, really, listening to the unbearable pain of the families. And some of the families asked representatives to read statements on their behalf, and 3 of the mothers found it within themselves to stand up in court and read aloud their thoughts, their pain, their trauma, their distress. And it was just quite breathtaking for everyone inside the court and those following proceedings remotely, because you cannot fail to be moved by what those families said in court today about just what Lucy Letby has done to their families. And it is very upsetting. We can't get away from the raw power and emotion of what they had to say, talking about how you explain to a surviving triplet what happened to his 2 brothers who died at the hands of Lucy Letby. How they've got through these last 7 years is quite something to behold, really. And knowing, of course, that this is at the hands of someone who was supposed to care for these children inside the most precious environment in a neonatal unit in a hospital has just made it very, very intensely difficult for them to deal with. And I think everyone else connected to the case has felt that as well, that the police officers involved, the court staff that we've spoke to and dealt with over the course of the last 10 months of this trial, this has touched everyone very, very closely. And we know these children as letters, don't we, between A and Q. And we must remember that while many of the victims' families have got a semblance of justice through guilty verdicts, the jury were not able to reach verdicts on every case. So some of the families have not had that idea of closure from getting to the end of a trial and knowing what happened. It's been left open because the jury, try as they did, quite clearly deliberating for so long, could not reach those conclusions. And
one of the dads even stormed out of court, didn't he, when he heard that the jury hadn't reached a verdict, slamming the courtroom door behind him.
Yeah, that happened on Friday. The stress, the anxiety and the pain of this trial has been quite marked. And I think that it will live in the memories of everyone who has reported or dealt with or put their professionalism into it. But at the heart of it are these babies and their families. And that is what we heard from in court today. And I think it would have moved everyone who heard it and has perhaps listened to some of the tributes today. And we heard from the judge at the end there. The impact of your crimes, he said to Lucy Letby, who of course was not in court, has been immense. Lives of newborns ended almost as soon as they'd begun, and lifelong harm caused. These are loving parents robbed of cherished children, and you caused deep psychological trauma.
OK, Tom, for the moment, thank you very much. And as we know, the judge also directly addressed those family members who chose to be in the public gallery today, saying, for those of you who have lost a child, you have my sincerest condolences. I am deeply conscious of your losses, Mr. Justice Goss said. Your lives were and will remain transformed by these events. So sentencing has now taken place here at Manchester Crown Court. Lucy Letby will spend the rest of her life in prison. Plenty more for you in a few moments. Hello again, welcome back to Manchester Crown Court, where the nurse Lucy Letby will spend the rest of her life in prison after being given a whole life order here at court for the murders of 7 babies and the attempted murders of 6 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Well, as we know, she refused herself to appear in court to hear the sentencing, and the families of the victims read out their very moving impact statements. Let's hear from the judge.
The methods you employed to carry out your murderous intent were only revealed by the later detailed investigation into the events of and surrounding the collapses and deaths of the babies, which commenced in 2018. There was premeditation, calculation, and cunning in your actions. The great majority of your victims suffered acute pain as a result of what you did to them. They all fought for survival. Some, sadly, struggled in vain and died. You used a number of different ways to try to kill them, thereby misleading clinicians into believing the collapses had, or might have had, a natural cause, or were a consequence of a developing medical condition. You took opportunities to harm babies when staff were in breaks or away from babies. On some occasions, you falsified records to indicate there were signs of a deterioration before a collapse occurred. You knew that the last thing anyone working in the unit would or did think was that someone caring for the babies was deliberately harming them. The impact of your crimes has been immense, as disclosed by the deeply moving personal statements that have been read to the court this morning. The lives of newborn or relatively newborn babies were ended almost as soon as they began, and lifelong harm has been caused, all in horrific circumstances. Loving parents have been robbed of their cherished children, and others have to live with the physical and mental consequences of your actions. Siblings have been deprived of brothers and sisters. You have caused deep psychological trauma, brought enduring grief and feelings of guilt, caused strains in relationships and disruption to the lives of all the families of all your victims. During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. In their totality, the offences of murder and attempted murder were of exceptionally high seriousness, and just punishment, according to law, requires a whole life order. Lucy Letby, on each of the 7 offences of murder and the 7 offences of attempted murder, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. Because the seriousness of your offences is exceptionally high, I direct that the early release provisions do not apply. The order of the court, therefore, is a whole life order on each and every offence, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison.
So the judge live on camera there within the last hour handing down his sentence to Lucy Letby, saying that there was premeditation, calculation, cunning in her actions. You cruelly and callously made inappropriate remarks to some of the grieving parents at the time of or in the immediate aftermath of a death. Quite horrific, the crimes that she carried out, but she has been given that life order for every single verdict that was handed down for the 7 baby murders and the 6 attempted murders. She will go to prison for life for each one of those counts. Extremely rare to hear a judge hand down that sort of sentence. Well, the police have reacted in the last few minutes, a reaction coming through all the time, of course. This is from Deputy Senior Investigating Officer, Detective Chief Inspector Nicola Evans, someone we've seen a lot of in the last couple of days as she's reflected on these crimes. She says today Lucy Letby has been handed a whole life order. The sentence reflects the true scale and gravity of her horrific crimes and ensures that a calculated and dangerous individual is behind bars for a very long time. She goes on to say nothing will bring back the babies who died or take away the pain and suffering experienced by all of the families over the years, but I hope that the significant sentence will bring some comfort at this dark time. The victim impact statements read out in court today on behalf of the parents are a chilling reminder of the pain and suffering that each family has had to endure over the years. Hearing their own experiences in their own words has been truly heartbreaking. I would once again like to say thank you to the families for putting your trust in us and for supporting an investigation that has been running for 6 years and a trial that has spanned almost 12 months. Our thoughts remain with you all at this incredibly difficult time. You are truly remarkable and will always have a place in our hearts. That is the Deputy Senior Investigating Officer, Detective Chief Inspector Nicola Evans. Interesting in court today, the family liaison officers, those police officers who spend time with the families during an investigation, during a trial, sitting next to those families that they've helped and supported. And they're all wearing the same badge, a little pin badge to show their unity and their solidarity. Well, other reaction today from the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, as well. Let's have a listen to that. Lucy Letby is not just a murderer, the Justice Secretary says, but a coward whose failure to face her victims' families, refusing to hear their impact statements and society's condemnation is the final insult. We are looking to change the law so offenders can be compelled to attend sentencing hearings. There has been a criticism, of course, that the government is dragging its heels in changing the law to make it compulsory for defendants in cases like this to be in court, to listen to the words, the final words of the judge, and of course to listen as the judge hands down that sentence, the difficulty being that no one wants the courtroom to be turned into a circus. That is all being looked at in light of this case. Also following the sentencing, we had a statement from the Crown Prosecution Service in Cheshire. They say today's sentence means Letby will never again be able to inflict the suffering she did while working as a neonatal nurse. She has rightly been brought to justice by the courts. My thoughts remain with the families and the victims who've demonstrated enormous strength in the face of extraordinary suffering. I hope that the trial has brought answers which had long eluded them. Pascal Jones there, the Senior Crown Prosecutor for the CPS in Cheshire. And of course we've heard from the families themselves, haven't we? The mother of baby A, Lucy Letby's first little victim. We never got to hold our little boy, the mum says, while he was alive because you took him away. What should have been the happiest time of our lives became our worst nightmare. Let's get the thoughts of Tom Parminter, who has been covering this trial and has been here for the sentencing. Interesting hearing from the Justice Secretary, from the police, from the CPS. Everyone has been touched by this, no matter how professional you are, and they're all talking about the heartache and sending the families their best wishes.
It is a truly shocking case that will be remembered for many, many years, and it's also quite baffling as to why a woman who was in her late 20s at that point would go about a killing spree in a neonatal unit where she worked, that sanctuary within a hospital for the tiniest premature babies. And the lack of a clear motive is something that has been one of the hallmarks of this trial, but they didn't need to prove a motive. They needed to prove whether or not she had committed these crimes, and that is something that they did in the majority of the cases and charges that Lucy Letby faced. You read out there the statement from the mother of child A and also the mother of child B, because they were twins. Now, child A was one of the murder victims, and his baby sister survived attacks by Lucy Letby in June 2015. And just to go through their case a little bit more, these were twins born 6 weeks premature, and they were being cared for on that neonatal unit that summer. And the experts in this case concluded that it was most likely that they had been injected with air by Lucy Letby. And the twin sister has survived, and she's now of primary school age. And the mother told the court today that they try to give her now the best life possible, and we will spend our lives doing that. She said, "We hope you live a very long life," to Lucy Letby, "and spend every day suffering for what you've done. We will never think of you again. From this day, you are nothing." And we know that the whole life order imposed by the judge here in the last hour at Manchester Crown Court means that Lucy Letby will never be released from prison, and she joins a very few number of those who are being held in prison under those terms, knowing that they will never be released, they are, as I say, reserved for the most serious offenders. Myra Hindley, the Moors murderer who died in 2002, was held under those terms in the latter stages of her sentence. Rosemary West, the partner of Fred West, who, of course, between them murdered women and girls in Gloucester. She is still held under one of these life orders. And Joanna Dennehy, she was responsible for 3 murders in Peterborough in 2013. 3 men that she stabbed and left to die in ditches and dumped their bodies in ditches. So these sentences are reserved for the most heinous crimes, and Lucy Letby will be driven away from this courtroom at some point this afternoon, having presumably been told that perhaps by her legal team in the cells, because, as we know, she refused to come out and face that moment of justice today, as she had done on a few occasions last week during the final stages of the verdicts being delivered. But another of the families described that as one final act of wickedness from a coward.
And her parents as well, who've been here every day of this trial, couldn't comprehend the truth about what was happening. They too staying away.
They did. Mr. and Mrs. Letby, who had been part of this trial, watching their daughter accused of these crimes, arrested of these crimes. One of the arrests happened at the family home down in Hereford. The others at Lucy Letby's address near the hospital in Chester. And one of the most remarkable things about this case was her relatively seemingly normal backstory. There was nothing particularly remarkable about Lucy Letby. She seemed to be someone who was dedicated to nursing, who would volunteer to come in and do extra shifts. But the chilling, horrific truth to what Lucy Letby was about, we now know. It's been laid out in court over many, many months. And I think anyone listening to those impact statements from the families today cannot fail to be moved by them. They are traumatic to listen to. And I know that many people in the court today were in tears listening to them. And as I say, 3 of the mothers managing to find the strength to stand up in court and say to the court what this has done to them.
Yeah.
And the cruel twist at the end of this is that Lucy Letby was not compelled to be in the dock listening to that moment. There were just 2 prison officers and an empty space where Lucy Letby should have been, and the judge made it very plain that he would be passing copies of his comments and also that of the family statements to Lucy Letby's defence team to pass on to her as she begins that whole life order.
Yeah, even one of those prison officers in tears at the end there. And you do wonder, don't you, Tom, just how those parents managed to get the strength to stand up in court and read those statements out to everyone who was present. But as we've been hearing from Tom, Lucy Letby herself wasn't. The Shadow Justice Secretary has accused the government of dragging their feet over changing legislation to force defendants to be in the courtroom to listen to the sentence being handed down. That's Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition, has been giving his reaction. Let's listen in.
Well, my thoughts are with the victims' families and the anger and frustration that I know they feel at the fact that she won't face justice in the way that she should. When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I saw for myself just how important it is for families to see the defendant in the dock being sentenced. It's an integral part of the way that we do justice in this country. Now, this isn't the first case. We've had other cases, the Olivia case up in Liverpool, and other cases where this has happened. I think that we should change the law. We've made an open offer to the government. If they come forward with a proposal to change the law, we will support it. I think they just really now need to get on with it so justice can be seen to be done.
If the government doesn't come forward with that proposal, it says it will, but it hasn't so far, why don't you put forward a Labour amendment to the legislation that's already going through Parliament at the moment?
Well, I want to see action as quickly as possible in this case because the victims' families have been through the most awful ordeal. They are entitled to see justice delivered with the full sentencing. So we need to change the law. I hope the government will do it because I think it can be done very quickly. If they don't, we will force an amendment to appropriate legislation. But actually, my position is to invite the government to get on with it to offer Labour support, so this could go through very, very quickly. This isn't the first case. The government has been dragging its heels on this. Get on with it for the sake of these victims and, of course, the other cases that went before it.
There are practical issues here, aren't there, that you would know as a lawyer. How do you enforce a criminal to listen, to attend, to be there for that sentencing, or at least to hear it?
There are practical issues involved, but I don't think that they should be seen as a barrier. There are a number of different ways this could be achieved, either by requiring the defendant to be in court for sentencing, or by giving judges power to add additional sentence for those that don't appear in the way that they should, so that victims and their families can see justice properly done. But what I don't want the government to do is to say, because there are practical problems, we won't do anything at all. They've been sitting on this one for the best part of a year now. We will work with them. We'll overcome the practical.
So that's Sir Keir Starmer giving his reaction to today's verdict, and also adding to the debate about forcing defendants to leave their cells and be in the courtroom for sentencing, arguing that the government needs to get on with it for the sake of victims. They are dragging their heels, also making the point that it can descend into a circus if defendants do cause trouble at that moment. But he's suggesting that maybe if defendants refuse to come into the courtroom, the sentence can be extended in some form. In Lucy Letby's case, of course, that is irrelevant because we know now she will never leave prison. You're watching Sky News at 1 o'clock. We're live from Manchester Crown Court. Coming up after the break, we'll have all the latest as Lucy Letby is sentenced to that whole life order for murdering 7 babies.
Inzamam Rashid, and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
$1,500 movies? I don't want this flight to end. Fly Emirates. Fly better.
Thank you.
Hello again, welcome back to Manchester Crown Court, where the nurse Lucy Letby will spend the rest of her life in prison after being given a whole life order here at court for the murders of 7 babies and the attempted murders of 6 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Now, she refused to appear in court to hear the sentencing, and the families of the victims read out their impact statements. We're going to cross now to Simon Harding, former senior investigating officer. Simon, good to see you this afternoon. Your thoughts on the sentence?
Yeah, I think it's the only sentence that really would have been applicable in this case. I mean, she joins a unfortunately illustrious number of people, you know, that we know of, Rose West and people like that who have performed multiple murders. And you know, it's a very, very sad day for many families, but they have justice in a way. Some didn't, which we need to think of as well. But a whole life order was the only appropriate sentence to be given.
And very, very rare, Simon.
Yeah, very rare, and you know, it is reserved for people like this, you know, who stand out in their particular crimes. And you know, we talk about many people who have received this whole life order who go on to kill adults and things like that. But this is taking the lives of the most innocent and the most vulnerable people in our society. You know, babies only a couple of days old, and yes, I mean, it's pleasing that she'll never ever see the light of day again.
Many of the police officers who worked on this investigation were in court today to listen to the sentencing. How frustrating is it for those detectives, for those officers who've worked night and day to bring this trial to fruition, for Lucy Letby not to have been in court?
Well, I think the officers themselves, I mean, obviously, as invested as they would have been in the whole case, along with the jury who would be invested, those that returned back to see sentencing, who would have wanted to see her as well. But we also have that issue where, you know, we can't, at the moment, they can't be forced to come up. But this is not about the police officers, and they will feel the same. This is about the families. The families deserved that final part of this horrible situation that they've had to endure for, you know, since the death of their children, but also through, you know, these court cases, which are incredibly hard to sit through when you listen to all the evidence that's presented about, you know, the death of your child.
OK, Simon, thank you. Simon Harding, former senior investigating officer. Let's just reflect on what one mum said in court today, the mum of little baby C. I miss Charles C every day. I miss everything we should have had. Her first smile, birthdays, Christmases. I think about what he would have looked like now. Good afternoon from Manchester Crown Court, where it's been decided that nurse Lucy Letby will spend the rest of her life in prison for the murder of 7 babies.
During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors.
The neonatal nurse refused to face families of her victims. The government confirms it's looking at a change to the law to force offenders into court for sentencing.
I think it's cowardly that people who commit such horrendous crimes do not face their victims and hear firsthand the impact that their crimes have had on them and their families and loved ones.
Meanwhile, the senior manager in charge of nursing at the hospital where Letby carried out her crimes is suspended from her current role.
Also this afternoon, the first tropical storm to hit California in more than 80 years. Hurricane Hillary brings record rains and flooding to Los Angeles. And on the front line of Scotland's drug death emergency, a Sky News special report on why the epicenter of Europe's overdose crisis may finally be turning a corner.
Hello there, good afternoon from Manchester Crown Court, where Lucy Letby, the neonatal nurse who murdered 7 babies in her care, will die in prison. The 33-year-old was handed 14 whole life orders for those murders and the attempted murders of 6 other infants. Letby has been labelled a coward. She refused to leave her prison cell to face her victims' families and to hear her sentence firsthand. Well, let's have a listen to what Mr. Justice Goss had to say.
As the number of unexpected and unexplained collapses and deaths escalated, senior doctors started to think the unthinkable and consider the possibility that someone was, in fact, deliberately harming the babies, and you were identified as the common factor. You had a detached enthusiasm for the resuscitations and what followed. You endeavoured to impress colleagues and clinicians and sought reassurance from them as to your competence and skills, and would message others to the effect that no one was at fault. On occasions, you cruelly and callously made inappropriate remarks to some of the grieving parents at the time of or in the immediate aftermath of a death. The methods you employed to carry out your murderous intent were only revealed by the later detailed investigation into the events of and surrounding the collapses and deaths of the babies, which commenced in 2018. There was premeditation, calculation, and cunning in your actions. The great majority of your victims suffered acute pain as a result of what you did to them. They all fought for survival. Some, sadly, struggled in vain and died. You used a number of different ways to try to kill them, thereby misleading clinicians into believing the collapses had or might have had a natural cause or were a consequence of a developing medical condition. You took opportunities to harm babies when staff were in breaks or away from babies. On some occasions, you falsified records to indicate there were signs of a deterioration before a collapse occurred. You knew that the last thing anyone working in the unit would or did think was that someone caring for the babies was deliberately harming them. The impact of your crimes has been immense, as disclosed by the deeply moving personal statements that have been read to the court this morning. The lives of newborn or relatively newborn babies were ended almost as soon as they began, and lifelong harm has been caused, all in horrific circumstances. Loving parents have been robbed of their cherished children, and others have to live with the physical and mental consequences of your actions. Siblings have been deprived of brothers and sisters. You have caused deep psychological trauma, brought enduring grief and feelings of guilt, caused strains in relationships and disruption to the lives of all the families of all your victims. Over a period of just under 13 months, you killed 7 fragile babies and attempted to kill 6 others. Some of your victims were only a day or a few days old. All were extremely vulnerable. They were in a hospital where others were striving to provide them with dedicated medical and nursing care. By their nature and number, such murders and attempted murders by a neonatal nurse entrusted to care for them are offences of very exceptional seriousness. The damaging impact of your actions on others working at that hospital, including those who numbered you as a friend, betraying their trust and creating upset and suspicion, as well as eroding confidence in clinicians and nurses generally, aggravates their seriousness. This was a cruel, calculated and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children, knowing that your actions were causing significant physical suffering and would cause untold mental suffering. You created situations so that collapses or causes of collapses would not be obvious or associated with you. You removed and retained confidential records of events relating to your crimes and checked up on bereaved parents. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions. During the course of this trial, you have coldly denied any responsibility for your wrongdoing and sought to attribute some fault to others. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. In their totality, the offences of murder and attempted murder were of exceptionally high seriousness, and just punishment, according to law, requires a whole life order.
Well, that was the highly charged moment a short time ago when Mr. Justice Goss handed down his sentence, telling Lucy Letby, who was absent from court, that she would never leave prison. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions, he told her. Well, there has been a huge amount of reaction, as you would expect, following that sentencing. We've had a statement from Pascal Jones, who is the senior Crown prosecutor in Cheshire. Today's sentence means Letby will never again be able to inflict the suffering she did while working as a neonatal nurse. She has rightly been brought to justice by the courts. That statement goes on to say, "My thoughts remain with the families of the victims who have demonstrated enormous strength in the face of extraordinary suffering. I hope that the trial has brought answers which had long eluded them." We know many of the families were in court today to hear that sentencing. Well, before the sentence and the family impact statements were read out in court, and they described Lucy Letby as evil, with her refusal to appear in court, calling it a final act of wickedness from a coward. And in the last hour, the Justice Secretary confirmed that the government was looking at a change to the law that would compel offenders to attend their sentencing. Yet the Prime Minister gave his reaction just before.
I think it's cowardly that people who commit such horrendous crimes do not face their victims and hear firsthand the impact that their crimes have had on them and their families and loved ones. And we are looking and have been at changing the law to make sure that that happens, and that's something that we'll bring forward in due course.
The Prime Minister there, and we've also heard from the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer.
My thoughts are with the victims' families, and the anger and frustration that I know they feel at the fact that she won't face justice in the way that she should. When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I saw for myself just how important it is for families to see the defendant in the dock being sentenced. It's an integral part of the way that we do justice in this country. Now, this isn't the first case. We've had other cases, the Olivia case up in Liverpool, and other cases where this has happened. I think that we should change the law. We've made an open offer to the government. If they come forward with a proposal to change the law, we will support it. I think it should be a statutory inquiry. And I'll tell you why. One, because that's what the victims' families want. And after what they've been through, I think that is a really important consideration. Secondly, what a statutory inquiry gives you is the power to order documents, to order witnesses, to come forward so we get the fullest, proper, comprehensive analysis of what went wrong here. So I think it has to be a statutory inquiry.
So Sir Keir Starmer there reflecting what many people are saying today, that defendants should be forced to appear in court when they are sentenced, and also making the point that the independent investigation, independent inquiry that's been announced by the government, which will begin shortly, should actually be a public inquiry, again compelling witnesses to attend, people who have been involved in any way in this horrific case. With me is our national correspondent Tom Parmenter, who's been covering events today and indeed for the last few years when it comes to the Lucy Letby case. You and I have covered many court cases in our time, Tom, but I don't think either of us have seen a day quite as emotional as today.
No, it was a truly breathtaking morning in court, and you could not fail to be moved by the words of the families who we know have been through this extraordinary 7-year period of going through that loss of a tiny baby and then having to try to understand and comprehend that the police were investigating those deaths, suspicious that somebody may have been responsible and that it wasn't a medical reason that their children collapsed or were killed or died on that neonatal unit. And the statements from the families that we heard in court were just heartbreaking. They spoke to the trauma, the devastation, the grief, the anger that has been wrapped up in these last 7 years for these families. And we know them in our reporting of this trial as letters, so child A through to child Q. But of course, these are not letters. These are sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, grandchildren. And their lives, in many of the cases, have been snatched away by the cruel actions of Lucy Letby, who we heard during the course of the trial weaponised her craft as a nurse, using quite innocuous things like milk or air to attack babies. And we heard in detail from some of the families, and some of the mothers actually managed to find the strength to stand up and speak to the court themselves and address the judge and the barristers and the public gallery and the journalists in the court. But of course there was one person missing from this trial culmination today, and that was Lucy Letby, who we know was in the building but again had refused to come up from the cells to listen to this final reckoning in the case. And that of course has added to the anguish of many of those involved. And the judge said he would make sure that she would be passed these victim impact statements, which were not on camera, but of course are such a crucial part of the court hearing, to allow the families the space and the time to really articulate just what this crime has done to them. If we pick out a few of them, and we will bring more of them to you through the course of the afternoon, but the case of child C. Now, this was a baby boy who was born prematurely, weighing 800 grams. In June 2015. He died on the 14th due to a deliberate introduction of air into his gut by Lucy Letby. And we know from the mother of child C, in her own words, she described her son. She said, "My tiny, feisty boy, my firstborn, my son. The trauma of that night will live with us all until the day we die. Knowing now his murderer was watching us was like something out of a horror story." And these quite unbelievable accounts from the families, just baffling how they've managed to compose themselves to deliver these words in court in some instances, or just hold it together through this traumatic trial over the last 10 months as the details of the care relating to their individual baby has been analysed in court. It was repeated again and again in court today. If we look at child D, the next fatality, the third fatality of Lucy Letby's killing spree, she died in the early hours of the 22nd of June 2015. Again, a deliberate injection of air into the bloodstream. This baby collapsed 3 times and on the 3rd time could not be revived. And we heard from the mother of child D in court, and she addressed Lucy Letby. She said, "You failed God and the plans we had for child D. I missed child D so much. I was desperate to smell her, to cuddle her." And as I say, this was repeated again and again from family after family, with Lucy Letby not in court listening to that. The judge said he will pass on those remarks to her. And it has certainly added to the anguish of those families, the fact that she has been able to hide from this moment of culmination for the criminal trial. It is intensely painful and distressing, but this criminal trial is now over for those families.
Yeah, will she ever hear those statements? I wonder whether she'll ever bother to read them or listen to them. Something tells me she may not bother. Of course, the families too have struggled in numerous ways, and it was outlined in court how some relationships had broken down. One of the fathers talked in length about how he had turned to drink and even at one point thought about taking his own life. Well, let's speak to the chair of the Criminal Bar Association now, Kirsty Brimelow. Very good to have you on the programme with us. Talk to me about this whole life sentence. The likes of Myra Hindley was handed one, Rose West as well, and now Lucy Letby.
Yeah, so these are sentences that are reserved for the most serious, and murder obviously is the gravest crime in the criminal offences calendar, but a full life tariff is for the most serious. And there's stats from the Ministry of Justice on the number of people who currently are under whole life tariffs. Are the number 66 as of the end of December 2022. So we're now obviously looking at 67.
Talk to me about this debate about whether or not she should have been forced to be in the courtroom today. Where do you stand on it?
I think it's very difficult to force a person to come into court. It doesn't usually happen, and there's good reasons for that. When you force somebody, their reactions, particularly if they've nothing to lose, their reactions in court might not necessarily be what you want. And I've certainly been in cases where a defendant who does not want to be there, even after a guilty verdict on murder, where there's been eruption in the dock, those proceedings in themselves then become disrupted for others there. It's very distressing then for others in court and families and friends of victims. And in those circumstances, the judge is then sending that defendant back down to the cells in order to prevent them from disrupting the next part of the proceedings. So it's high risk if you try and force somebody. It's high risk not only for the disruption and the distress that is caused in the proceedings, but it's physical high risk for those people who are actually having to handle the person. I mean, not every person is going to be somebody of Lucy Letby's size. And so if you were to bring this in, it would have to apply to everybody. And some of the, for example, some of the gangland killings, very violent gangs that the courts do deal with, it would be very, very high risk to try and manhandle them if they were refusing to move.
Yeah, of course you have to think of the safety of the prison officers, don't you? But I guess there are other solutions. Sir Keir Starmer suggesting that if someone refuses to come into the courtroom, they automatically get an extension to whatever sentence they're getting. Sir Robert Buckland, former Justice Secretary, saying, what about a live feed to the prison cell?
I think technology probably is the answer, in that we're in very different times to pre-COVID. And it's very common now to have live links to prisons. There would be no difficulty with having a link, therefore, to somebody in their cell if they did not want to leave their cell. And that could be done. I'd be slightly wary about having it as a visual link because of not being able to control the reaction of somebody who perhaps is being disrupted. But there's no reason why you couldn't set up a link so that the words of the families, the words of the victims are transmitted to them in the place where they are, and whether that would assist families that they know that their words are being heard directly by the person, whether that would assist, I don't know, but certainly technology does provide a lot of answers. As for adding on a term to a sentence, well, judges have contempt of court powers already. It's obviously with a whole life tariff, you can't add on a term to a whole life tariff. And it would be a little difficult, I think, with sentencing guidelines, perhaps to add on additional time. But certainly for contempt of court and so on, that could happen. But I doubt that would actually have much impact on somebody who is getting a tariff of 30, 40 years or a whole life tariff. It probably wouldn't make much difference to them.
And just briefly, if you would, you talked about technology there, and we saw the judge hand down his sentence on camera. What are your thoughts on having the whole trial on camera?
I'm actually against filming entire trials. There's a consultation actually going through at the moment where this exact issue is being looked at, and the Criminal Bar Association is submitting its response to it. After consideration, we could certainly see perhaps expanding some of the filming within courts, perhaps expanding some other aspects of submissions that aren't filmed at present. But once you go down the road of filming the whole trial, you're in a very different scenario. And we've seen a lot of instances in the United States where it has gone very badly wrong. And ultimately, you have to consider what is it that you want to achieve. The courts are open, justice is open, the reporting is absolutely fantastic. As you can see, there's so many reporters there reporting 24/7 on the cases. The difficulty with having cameras in and filming the whole case is that in itself can be a talking point rather than the actual evidence itself. And there has to be so many safeguards around it in order to ensure that the jury is not distracted or prejudiced in their job of actually objectively, forensically following the evidence and proceeding to the verdicts, which currently it works well. I don't see the arguments as to why to expand it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a balance, as you say, between openness and transparency and wanting to see more of that, but also the technical difficulties and not wanting to obstruct court proceedings in any way. Criminal Bar Association Chair Kirsty Brimelow, really good to get your thoughts today. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think it's just worth reflecting on what the judge did say today, Mr. Justice Goss, who has presided over this trial with huge skill and sensitivity. It's been a really long trial, especially for the jurors who have had to listen to such distressing evidence over a 9-month period. We know that they then went away for 22 days, 1 day for every charge, to consider their verdicts. They now, of course, can go back to their lives, but they will be changed forever. Mr. Justice Goss telling Lucy Letby before he sentenced her that she acted in a way completely contrary to the natural human instinct of caring and nurturing babies. You deliberately harmed them, intending to kill, he said. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions. We'll have plenty more coverage from outside Manchester Crown Court throughout the afternoon, but right now back to Kimberly for the rest of the day's news.
Jonathan, thank you. Now, the first tropical storm to hit California in more than 8 decades is bringing record rain and flooding to Los Angeles. Even desert areas like Palm Springs and Death Valley are experiencing the flooding. Our US correspondent James Matthews reports now from Palm Springs.